Julia Roberts stood at the hotel entrance. Calm. Tired. And the assistant manager said, "I'm sorry, but it appears you don't have a reservation. I'd suggest trying another property." That's when everything changed. The lobby of the Serena Bay Resort was exactly what you'd expect from a five-star property on the California coast. Marble floors that caught the late afternoon light. Floor-to-ceiling windows framing the Pacific. The kind of quiet elegance that whispered exclusivity without needing to shout it. Julia had driven 3 hours to get here. No driver. No assistant. Just her, a rental car, and the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones when you've been performing for cameras for 30 years and finally get a weekend off. She was wearing jeans. A cream linen shirt. Her hair pulled back. No makeup beyond what she'd put on that morning before leaving Los Angeles. She looked like what she was. A woman in her 50s who needed rest. The young man behind the reception desk, his name tag read Marcus, assistant manager, barely glanced up when she approached. "Good afternoon. Checking in?" His voice had that practiced hospitality tone that somehow managed to sound both welcoming and dismissive. "Yes. Roberts. Should be under Julia Roberts." Marcus typed something into his computer. Frowned. Typed again. His frown deepened. "I'm not seeing a reservation under that name, ma'am." He looked at her properly for the first time, taking in the simple clothes, the lack of luggage, the rental car keys in her hand. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, from professional neutrality to something that looked like suspicion. "Could you check again?" Julia's voice was quiet. Patient. She'd learned long ago that raising your voice never made people hear you better. More typing. More frowning. "No, I'm sorry. There's nothing here." "Are you sure you booked with Serena Bay Resort?" "I'm quite sure." Marcus glanced at his colleague, a younger woman organizing papers behind the desk. They exchanged a look. The kind of look that said, "We get people like this all the time. People who think they can just walk in." "Ma'am, I apologize, but without a confirmed reservation, I can't help you. We're fully booked this weekend. I'd suggest trying the Coastal Inn about 15 minutes south. They're more accommodating." The word hung in the air. Accommodating. Translation. Cheaper. For people who belonged there. Julia didn't move. She simply stood at the desk, one hand resting lightly on the marble counter, and looked at Marcus with an expression that held no anger, no indignation. Just a quiet kind of knowing. "Could I speak with your general manager, please?" Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. "The general manager is with guests at the moment. But I assure you, I have full authority to handle reservations, and as I've explained." "I'd like to speak with your general manager," Julia repeated. Same tone. Same calm. But something in her voice made it clear this wasn't a request anymore. Julia didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Marcus hesitated. Professional training warred with personal irritation on his face. Finally, he picked up the phone. "Mr. Chin? There's a guest at the front desk who insists on speaking with you." A pause. "No, sir. No reservation. She just..." Another pause, longer this time. "Yes, sir." He hung up and gave Julia a tight smile. "Mr. Chin will be down in a moment. You can wait in the lobby." Julia moved to one of the elegant chairs near the windows. She didn't pull out her phone. Didn't fidget. Just sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking out at the ocean while the hotel staff whispered behind the desk. 3 minutes later, a man in his 40s emerged from the elevator. Impeccable suit. Professional smile. David Chin had been general manager of the Serena Bay Resort for 8 years. He prided himself on knowing every guest by name, every preference, every detail. He approached Julia with his hand extended. "Good afternoon, I'm David Chin, the general manager. I understand there's been some confusion with your reservation?" Julia stood. Shook his hand. "Hello, David. Yes, there seems to be some confusion. David gestured back toward the desk. Let's see what we can figure out. Your name again? Julia Roberts. David's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition trying to break through. But the woman standing in front of him didn't match the image in his head. No entourage. No glamour. Just tired eyes and simple clothes. He moved behind the desk, took over the computer from Marcus. Typed carefully. Frowned the same way Marcus had frowned. I'm terribly sorry, Ms. Roberts, but I'm not finding anything. When did you make this reservation? I didn't, Julia said simply. David looked up, confused. I'm sorry? I didn't make a reservation. I don't need one. The lobby seemed to get quieter. Marcus stood very still. The woman organizing papers stopped organizing. David's professional smile strained slightly. Ma'am, I appreciate your situation, but as I'm sure you can understand, we can't accommodate guests without reservations, especially during our peak season. If you'd like, I can personally call some of our partner properties. Julia reached into her back pocket and pulled out a small leather card holder. She opened it carefully and placed it on the marble counter between them. Inside was a card. Embossed. Official. The resort's logo at the top, and beneath it, words that made David Chen's face go completely white. Owner. Julia Roberts. Serena Bay Resort Group. The lobby was silent except for the distant sound of waves through the windows. David stared at the card. Then at Julia. Then back at the card. His mouth opened but no sound came out. Marcus had gone rigid behind him, his face transitioning from confusion to horror and slow motion. Away from the cameras, Julia made a choice no one expected. Julia didn't smile triumphantly. Didn't raise her eyebrows. Didn't say, I told you so. She simply closed the card holder and put it back in her pocket. David, she said quietly, I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer honestly. If I had walked in here looking the way people expect Julia Roberts to look, designer clothes, sunglasses, an assistant carrying my bags, would you have asked for my reservation? David's face was the color of the marble counter. Ms. Roberts, I am so profoundly sorry. I didn't recognize. That's not what I asked? He swallowed hard. No, we wouldn't have asked. Julia nodded slowly. Why is that, do you think? The question hung in the air. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The woman behind the desk had tears in her eyes, though she wasn't sure why. Because, David struggled. Because we make assumptions. Based on appearance. On presentation. You do, Julia agreed. And I want you to think about something. How many other people have stood at this desk, tired, rumpled, without the right kind of luggage or clothes or bearing, and been turned away? Not because they didn't belong here, but because they didn't look like they belonged here. Ms. Roberts, please let me. She held up one hand. Gently. I'm not angry, David. But I need you to understand why I'm here like this. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened 6 months earlier. Julia Roberts didn't buy the Serena Bay Resort Group on a whim. She'd been staying at their properties for years. Quiet weekends when she needed to escape, anniversaries with her husband, family vacations where her kids could run on the beach without paparazzi. She'd watched how the staff treated different guests. The warm welcome for people who arrived in luxury cars. The subtle coolness toward families who looked like they'd saved for a year to afford one weekend by the ocean. She'd seen a housekeeper, an older woman named Rosa, treated dismissively by a guest who snapped fingers instead of using words. She'd watched Rosa smile through it, professional to the end, and then seen the woman's hands shake slightly when she pushed her cleaning cart down the hallway. Julia had followed her. Asked if she was okay. Rosa had looked at her with surprise, not because she recognized Julia Roberts the actress, but because someone had asked. That conversation changed everything. Julia started asking questions. How were staff treated? What were their wages? Their benefits? What happened when guests were rude or worse? The answers troubled her. So she called her financial manager and asked a simple question. What would it cost to buy it? 3 months of negotiations later, Julia Roberts owned the resort group. 12 properties. 347 employees. And a mission that had nothing to do with return on investment. She wanted to change how service workers were treated. How guests understood dignity. How assumptions about worth, about who deserved respect, were challenged every single day. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. The first thing Julia did as owner was tour every property unannounced. Dressed simply. No advance notice. Just walked in like any other guest and watched. She saw the pattern everywhere. Designer luggage, instant upgrade. Simple clothes, suspicious looks. Luxury car, immediate deference. Rental car, questions about payment methods. She saw kindness too. Staff members who treated everyone with equal warmth. Managers who led with grace. But she also saw the subtle hierarchies, the unspoken codes that decided who deserved the best service. Today was the final property on her tour. The flagship. Serena Bay Resort, where she'd stayed countless times before, where she'd specifically requested they not inform the staff of the ownership change. She'd driven herself. Dressed as plainly as possible. Left her wedding ring in the car. Wanted to see exactly how someone who looked like just anyone would be treated. And now she had her answer. David Chin stood behind the desk looking like his entire career was flashing before his eyes. Marcus had gone very pale. But Julia's expression wasn't harsh. It was thoughtful. Almost sad. Here's what's going to happen, Julia said, her voice still quiet, still calm. I'm going to check into the owner's suite that I know you keep available for VIP arrivals. You're going to personally carry my bag. I left it in the car, gray canvas, nothing special. And then you're going to call a meeting with your entire front of house staff for tomorrow morning. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Anything. I'm not finished. Julia's voice didn't rise, but David stopped talking immediately. At that meeting, you're going to tell them what happened today. Everything. How you assumed I couldn't afford to be here because of how I looked. How you offered to direct me to a cheaper property. How you made me prove I belonged in a place I own. David nodded, his throat working. I understand. And then, Julia continued, you're going to implement a new policy. Every guest who walks through those doors gets the same greeting. The same warmth. The same assumption that they belong here. I don't care if they arrive in a limousine or on a bicycle. I don't care if they're wearing designer labels or clothes from a thrift store. Everyone gets treated like they matter. Yes, ma'am. Julia looked at Marcus, who looked like he might cry. You're young, she said, not unkindly. You made a mistake that a lot of people make. You saw simple clothes and tired eyes and assumed that meant less money, less importance, less worth. But here's what I want you to learn. The woman in jeans might own the building. The man with the worn suitcase might be a veteran who's served this country. The family that looks out of place might have saved for 2 years to give their kids one perfect weekend. She paused, making sure he was really listening. You don't get to decide who deserves dignity. Everyone deserves dignity. That's not hospitality philosophy. That's just being human. But what followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, forever. Julia didn't storm off to her suite. She didn't demand apologies or groveling. Instead, she did something no one expected. She walked back to the reception desk and stood beside David. Show me your reservation system, she said quietly. I want to understand how you flag VIP arrivals. For the next 20 minutes, Julia Roberts, Oscar winner, Hollywood icon, owner of the entire resort, stood behind the reception desk learning the computer system. She asked about staff training, about complaint procedures, about how employees were supported when guests were rude. Marcus watched, stunned, as this woman he dismissed transformed the entire operation with quiet questions and careful listening. Before she left for her suite, Julia turned back to the desk. She pulled out her card holder again, but this time she removed a different card, a handwritten note she'd been carrying for months. She placed it on the counter. "This is from Rosa. She worked housekeeping at your Santa Barbara property. She wrote it the day before she retired." Julia's voice was soft. "Read it when I'm gone. Remember what she said about being seen." That night, Davidson read Rosa's note. It was simple: "Thank you for asking if I was okay." 6 months later, the Serena Bay Resort Group won industry awards for staff satisfaction and inclusive hospitality. But Julia never attended the ceremonies. She'd already moved on to the next property, the next quiet weekend, the next chance to see how people treated strangers. The card holder stayed in her pocket. Just in case someone needed reminding, dignity isn't earned. It's owed.